Hi, everybody. I'm Jill Miller, founder and CEO of Luna. Uh, Looking forward to the next few minutes with you from the Empowering Women 2023 conference, where we had a lovely panel on gender equality and how do you measure that. Uh, Shannon Baumgardner of Train had joined us as our facilitator and MC, where she's a channel support leader and hosts the Empowering Women podcast. And she is definitely a STEMinist. She was great to work with. And then Daryl Ann Estill from TD Industries, who is also a very brave and courageous leader in terms of women advancing in the workplace. And then I joined as well, and I'll just give you a quick background on me. I founded Lunam a few years ago after spending 20 years in industrial America and decided I wanted to bring some solutions around how we drive change for gender and racial equality. I started the company because I thought there was a better way. I knew there was a better way to evaluate how companies are performing on their workforce impact. And at this time, I've shifted toward promoting sustainable prosperity for workers and communities. This is just a snapshot of my career. So what I want to talk about today for the next 10 or 15 minutes is the current state of our industry. And when I say that, I mean processing materials, manufacturing when it comes to women. So let's dive in. First, let's take a look at a recent report from Revelio Labs on data that analyzed women's enrollment in STEM. I am not thrilled to say that women's enrollment in STEM programs and majors has stagnated since 2018 and started declining significantly through the pandemic, as you can see here. Additionally, when it comes to women in the industry, engineering roles have a low share of women. Certainly, we all know that women have not been overly represented in engineering, but right now we're at a point where only 1 in every 10 electrical engineers is a female. And what we'll get into is that we're underrepresented, and I think these show that we are also walking away. Let's dive in and look at maybe what the future looks like. So when I think of the world, I always want to buy the world a Coke in a fully recyclable, compostable bottle where everyone has a chance to flourish. But that also means in the business world that we have to think about our brand value, the valuation of our organizations, how we're driving revenue and growth, and then reducing risk and turnover when we're talking about some of our initiatives. So as we explore this, I invite you to consider what role your company can play in advancing women's empowerment, both within your own walls, your community, and across the broader industry. I'd love it if we could collectively envision a future where women thrive in every facet of the industrial sector, and where your organizations, if you're listening today, if you joined us at Empowering Women in Industry, that you stand as beacons of progress and equality. I would challenge everyone to engage with the findings with an open mind and a willingness to take action. I do hope by the end of this discussion, you'll recognize the value of some of this information and a different way of thinking, and that it guides your organizations toward a more equitable and inclusive future. So let's just pause first. When we talk about diversity and empowering women in the workplace, we are starting to find that the data shows it's not just a moral imperative, that it's also a strategic advantage. Diverse teams are more innovative, more adaptable, more successful. And according to a report by Just Capital recently, companies who are worker leaders and focus on what I would call the S and ESG or human capital impact, those companies are also outperforming the market by roughly 12% over the last 20 months, which is fantastic. I always think in terms of impact, so we're going to continue down that road, and I'll hopefully take you on the journey. But the question is how do we measure impact today? Because I think this is one of the missing links in how we drive progress. So we'll continue to talk about women in producer manufacturing industry. And at this point, from a 100,000-foot view, this is what most of us are looking at. Females and diverse women are not well represented as they could be. There's about 6.7 million people in the producer manufacturing industry, and only about 31% of those are female. When we look at a demographics breakdown, most of these women tend to be white, and only about 7% are Asian, 8% Hispanic, and 12% are Black. And I'll pause here to say that when we look at diversity, we want to focus on locality and not the overall US population. So this is an aggregate of millions of workers, but it is also showing, I think, that in many areas we need to dive a little deeper. So as we dive deeper, I want to talk a little bit, I'll come back to demographics, but talking a little bit about seniority and women. There are about 9,000 senior level jobs in this industry set. Only 22% of those jobs were held by females above the managerial level in 2018. And in 2023, we see that 23%. So despite all the work we are doing, we're not making too much progress with women in leadership. So when we look at how these women are advancing, raw data shows us only about 20% of those women are in managerial positions. Very broadly, this isn't acceptable. And I think firms have to ask themselves how, in the next step, how are they performing relative to others out there? So when we took 5 companies who are very involved in the sector, we looked at where they perform against the industry, and you can see they all have varying levels of women advancing through seniority levels. And from going from like 100K to 50K, we want to get to comparison. So if we just look inside our own 4 walls, we don't really have anything relative to speak to. And what we think is missing is depth. There's a lot of information about there, but we don't get really granular on things. So I'll just walk you through sort of a theory of change. Most organizations look at inputs and outputs when they make announcements. They say things like, we're going to have 38% women by 2030. So what they're doing is they're setting a goal, then they're going out, putting some business resources toward that. 2 years later, they may measure that they hit 38% of women. But essentially, that's an input output, which does lack depth. And what we're looking for is, how do we move toward outcomes, measuring the value of those outcomes within our communities, our businesses, and for our workers, and placing a dollar value on those. So we were hoping to shine a light in some new places. And what I always like to say is improve human flourishing, and look at the long term and where the communities that you are doing business have a chance for thriving and prosperity. So we believe that a lot of this is illuminating but transformative for discussions on women's empowerment in the workplace. So the next step is really to start measuring and tracking and looking at where people size up against each other across industrial America. And I think of this in terms of impact thinking. And this is that impact thinking requires that we have something to compare against relative to where we are. Here's an example of those 5 companies you saw earlier. And this is one way to look at it. We can benchmark, we can look at impact. I won't go into it too deeply. Lunam calculates what companies are doing in terms of diversity, demographic, jobs that are equitable, and people who are moving through in terms of seniority and opportunity, and then diversity as well. So in looking at those 5 companies from earlier, this is where they stack up against our framework. And you may remember company A in the couple slides ago, they had the highest number of females in senior leadership. And by our methodology, they are also showing highest impact per worker across their organization. And not surprising, I think there's a pattern here. And then we also look at living wage, wage quality, which is essentially asking the question of which demographics in an organization or across a supply chain or an ecosystem cannot meet basic needs. And in this case, we took the data and looked at it a little differently, which is we aggregated those 5 companies up in totality. And then we looked at who couldn't meet basic needs most frequently within that grouping, and say this was your supply chain. So say you're a public company, you want to understand your contribution to racial wealth gap. We can pull data, aggregate it up, and start to show you where the inequities exist within your supply chain or your ecosystem. And in this case, which is not surprising to the larger macro data, Black and Hispanic females tend to be the most underpaid and struggling the most to meet basic needs. And I just want to point out that when I talk about basic needs and living wage, I'm not talking about minimum wage. I'm talking about what it takes to feed your children, live in an area where there's appreciating rents or home values. I'm also talking about being able to pay for medical, have access to healthcare, et cetera. So you can see here just by salary and gender, females earn about $8,000 less on average per capita across the industry. And when we look at equal pay for equal work, again, similar situation. This is the same 5 groupings, and Black and Hispanic females tend to be the most affected when it comes to pay equity. So I want to go into another little case study, which is looking and measuring the impact of a company that's a very high performer in the industry. And what we did is we took a look at this. This is a subcategory of what we were looking at originally. So we applied our methodology. And again, I won't get too deep into it, but this is a Harvard developed framework for calculating how impactful wages paid are to the workforce when you consider things like diversity, wage quality, opportunity, and positive job creation. So what this does is it allows us to use a robust framework to standardize and compare various sectors against one another. And what we do is we normalize that on a per capita basis. So that was a lot of information, but ultimately what we're talking about is that if you look on the left here, you're seeing an entire industrial sector from top performance down to low performance. And on the left-hand side, you see a couple of pretty high performers. So when I saw that, I was fascinated. And I took them and I compared them against a few of their peers, where again, women don't hold a high number, but in particular, this company on the bottom called Biotrex. Biotrex has many, many more women in leadership and pretty outsized compared to their competitors. So I got very curious and dug into who this company was. This is actual data. And when I looked at this company, I was not familiar with them. They position themselves as a biotech company, what I think of as kind of like the new frontier in manufacturing. They position themselves as biotech across diverse markets, with a responsibility to ensure that the product is used for positive purposes, and they consider stakeholders when making decisions and advancing their mission. When I did some deeper dive, I found that they've been focused on diversity, women's empowerment since the beginning of the company, which was many years ago. And they've been transparent throughout as they speak to their stakeholders, whether it be investors or customers or consumers. What I found that was so interesting as I dove into the qualitative information and the self-reported information was that in 2020, they announced that they had a pay equity issue. And they set, beyond what they were already doing in sustainability, set additional measurable public and time-bound goals, saying that they were going to close those pay equity gaps. And just to step back, this is Biotrex compared to those peers in that original chart, which just shows me this is all curated data. So we're pulling data and verifying it against what's being publicly reported. So the company here did not report the data. We actually curated it and transformed it and gathered some insights on it. So we can look at this trend over time and what it shows us. But what it doesn't give us many times is the baseline and what we're measuring against and what the definition of good looks like. So I want to dig into that pay equity announcement that they made a little bit more. And when we dig into it, what we see is they made an announcement in 2020 that they had a pay equity problem. They publicly announced that they were going to address that. So I'll step back and say that if they knew in 2020 and they were reporting it, they were already aware in 2019 of what was going on. And what we see here in the data, if you look at the arrow, they hit a down point in a low point in 2019. By the time they announced it, they were already halfway to closing some of those gaps. And then they continued up through 21. We did see it trail off in 22, and we're going to keep an eye on it in 23. But I suspect that they're going to be able to use this information to adjust and make changes and learn from it. So overall, in terms of impact thinking, why do we think this is a game changer? At Lunam, we think that it brings credibility to a lot of organizations because there's finally a standard to measure against. There's benchmarks, and you can start to begin to drive change when you look at yourselves against others. Transparency. We need to get to a place of transparency, self-reporting among organizations and among supply chains that aren't regulated can create reputational risk. So being transparent and using third-party data collection and verification methods tends to help organizations. And then we look at commitment, right? Companies make commitments. They are supported, but what we're looking for is values-based action. And I think most of the stakeholders are as well. And we feel like we've got some DEI metrics that matter that will start to change the way we think about the connection between community impact, workforce impact, and business impacts. So I think the big question is what's next? A negative impact is just a missed opportunity to impact our communities positively and women positively, but we can't continue to talk about where we're good without acknowledging where we can improve. At Lunam, I certainly don't claim to have all the answers just yet. And I don't think we all know what good looks like, but we certainly know what better looks like. And we hope that through this information and the good work you're doing in your organizations to advance women, that we can equip you with wealth of knowledge so that you can make a better informed decision and enable different behaviors on how we get to a more equitable tomorrow. So again, I'm Jill Miller with Lunam, and I appreciate your time and listening to our discussion on gender equality. How do you measure that? Have a wonderful day, and look forward to seeing you all at Empowering Women again next year. Bye now.